say you write your books for family caregivers, but Me Time Monday seems like a book that could benefit any adult. So that's a great question because I do. When I first sit down and I do any kind of writing, I typically think about family caregiving, aging, people who are older, or how we age, across our lives. That's kind of my orientation as a gerontologist. But what happened with this book is I realized that wellness was broader and actually fits into any, age stage of our lives. And that becomes really important because some of the things I write about in the book. So, for instance, there's a chapter called "Wellness Begins in the Womb," and it's all about the epigenetic effect of how we can have some switches on our DNA change just by the influence of being in our mother's womb, and then it can have effects later in life. And there's a whole story about Dutch children during World War II that I tell about that kind of illustrates that fact. But it's really important to understand that so many of the things that we do, of course, early in life can affect our health and our well-being later in life, but that doesn't mean that just because, maybe you didn't do everything right when you were younger, or you just stopped smoking and you're 50 years old, it doesn't mean that you can't practice better health practices that are going to benefit you for these bonus years that we get in life. So you can really start your wellness plan at any time. And it's also, again, it's not gender specific because a lot of these techniques and a lot of the things I talk about in terms of the 7 elements of life aren't specific to women or men. It is more about just generically as humans, because so much of what I really focused on in the book, and we have another question, so I'm not gonna answer all of that in this particular question, but I'm really dedicated to how neuroscience, which is, the science of the brain and brain health, how that couples with nature to create our wellness that we need. And so, how do our brains work? What are the things we need to think about in terms of stress response and the brain? And what are the things that we can do that comfort the brain and bring that brain back into a calming effect and give it a wonderful world that it's living in, and all these things. But I really focus a lot on the brain. And of course, we all have brains, so it's relevant for anybody and really anybody of any age. The other thing, too, is that, again, I typically write for family caregivers, very often the sandwich generation, which are the caregivers caring for children as well as older adults. That doesn't mean that if you're older that you wouldn't be interested in this book because I talk very much about, what we need to do in our 70s, 80s, and 90s to maintain certain wellness and health and happiness and other things. And what's really interesting is that, I shared some of the chapters and the themes with my nephew who's in his early 20s, and then my mom who's almost 80, 79 mom, not 80 yet. But so that's a very diverse, age group, and they all had interesting things to say and said, "Oh yeah, this is really interesting." So I feel very confident that this is a book that definitely will appeal to a lot of people. But again, I kind of, the upfront of the book is really about family caregiving and what's happening with our longevity in our bonus years and how we have to think about that in terms of, it's a marathon, not a sprint. How do we manage that caregiving and not let us, get us off the wellness road, get us detoured so that we don't have enough time and have the ability to practice some of these wellness practices, which is really, really important. The other thing is that I give a little bit of a definition to caregiving, which I think is trending right now. It's actually evolving, and I don't know that anyone's really specifically talking about it in this context, but one of the things that happened is a few years ago, the Harvard Business School came out with a new study that was done among employers and employees, and it showed that 1 in 3 employees are actually caregiving. Now, the definition of caregiving in this study was anyone caring for a child all the way through caring for older parents, in laws, or grandparents. So it was a very broad definition. If we want to break it down, people who are working, who are employees, who are caring for someone over the age of 50, so this is going to be more typically maybe a spouse, or again, a parent, in law, grandparent, or maybe a sibling or a friend. But if you're caring for someone over the age of 50 and you're working, that's 1 in 6 employees. So this is becoming a real important area for employers, which is where I do a lot of my work with HR departments and others, work-life benefits companies and things like that. And one of the things that I did in the book is I took now this broader definition of caregiving and I said, okay, let's look at this, put it in the context of former First Lady Rosalind Carter, who was the first person, by the way, to identify burnout in caregivers. And she had a famous saying that basically at some point in life, we're all going to be caregivers. Well, I want to take that and I want to kind of expand that a little bit. And what I looked at is okay, we start life being cared for, we end life being cared for, and then in between, we're forming relationships, okay? And those relationships may take us down the path of having a spouse or partner. We may decide to have children. We may have older parents again, grandparents, aunt, uncle that we're caring for. I even saw a commercial the other day that said, caregivers of pets. So if you have a pet, you're a caregiver. Anyway, this definition of caregiving is now very broad. And then what's the underlying across that life course that we have? What is the underlying constant? And it's self-care. So this is where I'm really focused. So if we go ahead and accept this broader term of caregiving and we say it's really not about just people who are in their midlife or older, caring for older adults, it really happens throughout life. It just depends on who, when, where, what our choices are in our relationships. I think hopefully that might get us to a place where we can plan a little bit better for what we don't plan for now, which is the older care, caring for older adults. It often happens in a crisis, but we have to recognize now we are living older. This is going to become a big part of life just as much as the other relationships that we have in our lives. So how do we plan a little bit better? And again, how do we not get derailed with our own self-care because we've taken on now an additional person that we're caring for throughout life? And that's just part of having linked lives. Humans are social animals. We need to be together to survive. We don't survive as loners. And, in ancient times, when you were kicked out of the tribe or the group, you couldn't really survive on your own. And that kind of plays out today as well. We have this need for these relationships. And so how do we better support employees? How do we better support people, particularly for the one that we don't plan as much for, which is the later in life caregiving? But caregiving is a constant, and that's why I call it Gen C, Generation Caregiver, and it doesn't have to do with age or gender or where you live or any of the typical demographics. It actually has to do with psychographics. And psychographics is something that I've studied for a long time, having been in marketing positions throughout my career. And psychographics is really more about attitudes and beliefs and needs of a certain group. And I can't think of a better way to describe caregivers because, in general, there are some basics that all caregivers need. And then we'll have some specifics depending on maybe what the disease or the disability or the person we're caring for, if it's a younger person versus an older person, there will be some specifics. But basically, Generation C is the continuum that we have throughout life. That's the role we're all going to play, generation caregiver. And that is a lot of the upfront explanation of the book Me Time Monday.